Africa has often portrayed itself as a continent of contrasts and cultures, and typically harbored the label of poverty-stricken in the eyes of the Western world. Despite Africa's abundance of natural beauty and abundance of resources, its inhabitants remain poor and face hardship. And there are multiple reasons why the richest continent, in terms of natural resources and cultural diversity, is impoverished. Often, we are a people with little patience for history or interest in the effects of past events on the present. Nevertheless, in this video, we delve into the various reasons why Africa is still poor. So make sure to watch this video till the end. There is no doubt that Africa is a continent rich in natural resources, as the continent possesses abundant minerals, oil, and other kinds of raw materials. Although many African nations enjoy this wealth, they are still impoverished and underdeveloped despite these resources. As a result, these countries have not been able to harness their natural resources for economic growth and development for several unique reasons. There are several reasons why African nations struggle with poverty, and one of the main ones is a lack of good governance in their countries. There are many developing countries on the continent that are plagued by corruption, nepotism, and weak institutions, which makes it difficult for them to effectively manage the resources and for the countries to prosper. It has been observed that a few leaders have used the position of power as a means of enriching themselves and their cronies, rather than making investments in the development of their countries. And because of this, limited resources are being invested in the development of social programs and infrastructures. Additionally, a weak institutional framework as well as insufficient accountability often lead to capital flight, making it increasingly difficult for the country to attract investments as a whole. There is also another reason for African nations to remain poor, which is their lack of infrastructure. There are many countries on the continent that have inadequate basic infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and electricity grids. It is difficult for businesses to operate in this kind of environment, and it is difficult for people to access essential services, such as healthcare and education. Moreover, poor infrastructure can make it difficult to transport goods and resources, which in turn can limit economic growth and development. Not only that, but in addition to this, the lack of access to reliable, affordable energy has been a significant constraint on industrial growth. Affordable energy has been a significant constraint on industrial growth, trade, and overall economic development for a long time in African countries, which made them rely on charity and other financial bits of help from other countries. There are also challenges facing African nations when it comes to their education and human capital. There are many countries on the continent that have low levels of education and a lack of skilled workers. Due to this, it becomes more difficult for industries and sectors that require specialized knowledge and expertise to develop and grow. It is also important to note that a lack of education can limit innovation and creativity, which are essential to the growth and development of an economy. It seems obvious that many African countries lack the resources to adequately fund their education systems, resulting in many children not being able to receive a quality education. Due to this, the country does not have a skilled workforce, which in turn limits the potential for economic growth. Among the unique challenges facing African nations is the legacy of colonialism, which has plagued the continent for centuries. Throughout the history of the continent, there have been many countries that were colonized by European powers, which often exploited their resources and their people. Because of this legacy, we have become dependent on the export of raw materials, which has resulted in an underdeveloped manufacturing sector. The legacy of colonialism has had long-term effects on African nations, including the emergence of deep-seated inequalities, political instability, and economic dependence on former colonial powers in order to run their economies. As a consequence, raw materials have a limited ability to be added to in order to create value before they are exported, which limits economic growth. African nations are also experiencing a number of global economic challenges in addition to these factors, including the fluctuating prices of commodities and unequal trade relationships with their neighbors. As I mentioned earlier in the video, a number of African countries are heavily dependent upon exporting raw materials from their countries, which is a market that can be prone to volatility. Moreover, it is also important to note that trade relationships with developed countries are often unbalanced, with African countries receiving low prices for their exports and faced with barriers when trying to export finished goods from their countries. For example, Africa receives low prices for its exports and creates barriers to exporting finished products to developed countries. And obviously, this ultimately results in the African economies remaining vulnerable to global market fluctuations. It is no secret that there have been prolonged periods of conflict and political instability in many African nations. The effects of this have had significant effects on the growth of the economy and the development of society. Often, conflict is caused by the destruction of infrastructure, the displacement of people, and the loss of productive capacity as a result of war. It is also possible for political instability to deter foreign investment and result in capital flight as well. Not only this, but even more surprising is the fact that climate change is also becoming a greater challenge to the countries across Africa as a whole. Climate change impacts, from droughts, floods, and other natural disasters such as cyclones, have resulted in a loss of agricultural productivity and the rise of food insecurity, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Consequently, poverty in these regions is further exacerbated by this situation. Talking about stats, according to the World Bank, on an income of less than $1.93 a day, and approximately 460 million people live in extreme poverty on the continent. Considering that the continent of Africa had around 1.4 billion inhabitants in 2013, an estimated third of the continent's population lived in extreme poverty at that time. Mainly, there are 3 countries in Africa with the highest rates of extreme poverty: Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and South Sudan. More than 75% of the people in this country lived on less than $1.90 a day in 2019. In spite of the fact that it is predicted that poverty levels on the continent will decrease in the next few years, Africa will remain the poorest region in the world when compared to the rest of the world. Thus, although African nations are rich in natural resources, they are still suffering from poverty and underdevelopment despite their wealth of natural resources. The reasons for this are quite complex, and they include weak governance, poor infrastructure, a lack of education and human capital, the legacy of colonialism, and global economic challenges as a result of globalization. As a result of these issues, there will need to be a concerted effort from African governments, international organizations, as well as the global community to provide the development of strong institutions, investment in infrastructure and education, as well as striving to reach a fair and equitable trade agreement. However, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Based on projections from the World Data Lab, Africa has now reached a milestone in its fight against poverty. According to the World Data Lab, in March 2019, for the first time since the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, more Africans were escaping extreme poverty than are falling or being born below the poverty line. However, the progress of this net poverty reduction is very slow. About 367 people per day are now escaping extreme poverty. By the end of this year, this rate of poverty reduction will increase to something over 3,000 people per day, resulting in a reduction of 1 million people in the total number of people living in poverty in Africa. It is estimated that African countries are on track to reduce their ranks of the extremely poor by 45 million by 2030. And the percentage of those who are living in relative poverty will decline from 33.5% today to 24% by 2030 if these trends continue. The fact remains, however, that the continent will still be unable to meet Sustainable Development Goal 1, which aims to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. There are approximately 377 million Africans who will remain living below the poverty line, and very few African countries will have ended poverty by the year 2050. So, let's hope that one day African nations will also stand up for themselves and will become a force to be reckoned with. What do you guys have to say about it? Tell us in the comments. And that's it for today's video. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more such videos like this. Don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified when we upload a new video. We'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, peace.